putting my Lowrider ST to the test, 2-up moto camping. Let's talk about it. Alright, what's going on YouTube? FXDLS Brooklyn is back in the building. And as you can see, the bike is still fully packed, but fully packed in a way where there's obviously a place for the passenger to sit because we just got done with a 2,000-mile moto camping trip. I wanted to make a video talking about how the bike performed in one of the most extreme conditions that you could put a sport touring bike in, which is not just moto camping, which is already a pretty challenging thing that most people don't do, but 2-up moto camping is what I believe in terms of sport touring is one of the most challenging things you could do on a bike like this. So that's a way that I definitely tested my Dyna before, and I was excited to see how the Lowrider ST would do in those conditions. So I figured this one might be helpful for some of you who got your eyes on, say, a 2023 Lowrider ST. So to cut to the chase in terms of did the bike rise to the occasion of a very challenging bike trip? The answer is yes. And when I talk about this being a challenging bike trip, the entire trip was moto camping and the entire trip was in challenging conditions. It was heavy raining almost the entire trip, right? We were in conditions where we were having to navigate through mud, hilly, steep terrain, gravel, unpaved roads. Pretty much some of the worst conditions you could throw at a fully loaded bike with a passenger on it. And what I'll say is, again, off the bat, this bike handled it like an absolute champ. And the first point that I'll make here is not only did the bike handle it like a champ, but the bike handled it like a champ pretty much out the box. In order to put this bike in one of the most extreme conditions, such as 2-up moto camping, there wasn't many things I actually had to do to the bike to prepare it to do that. So for example, the only things I needed to do this bike to make that happen was get a seat that would be comfortable for a passenger. This is the Saddlemen STC Pro with gel pads. Get a sissy bar with a luggage rack for the gear, and get a set of passenger bags. And literally, that's it. Those three things allowed me to put this bike through one of the most challenging situations. That was the first point I wanted to make is, like I said, there wasn't much I had to do to this bike to get it to handle a trip like that like a boss. So the second point I want to make about the bike and how well it did on a challenging bike trip, I talk about the smoothness of this bike, how it just runs so smooth, you know. The geometry of the frame, the ergonomics of the bike, the suspension, a monoshock, and of course an inverted front end gives you an extremely smooth ride on this bike in comparison to the Dyna platform, which is what I have most of my touring miles on. So one of the things that was noticeable about this bike is we were doing pretty much days of 300 plus miles in all back roads, which if you convert that to highway miles, we're talking that feels like a 600-mile day. Again, hard miles through the rain and back roads ain't the same as just cruising down the highway. So we were doing hard mile days. Like I said, I wouldn't really have that buzzing feeling that I would have from the Dyna after a really long day of riding, say like a day of hard miles on the back roads, or say a 800 plus mile day. You know, you get off the bike and you have that buzz a little bit. This bike never really gave me that, and again, it just runs so smooth. It just runs so damn smooth, and again, that was very apparent when I would get off the bike. So again, just the general smoothness of the bike was noticeable. That's what sport touring is, meaning that you could load it up in the most extreme situations, put a passenger in the back, load on everyone's luggage, and you could still throw this bike around the twisties. And I will tell you that this bike was able to do that. With Jenny on the back, with all of her stuff and all of my stuff and moto camping gear, I was still confidently able to throw this bike around the twisties as well as navigate really hard situations. The suspension and the general ergonomics of the bike, even fully loaded, still allowed me to fully enjoy this bike, especially in the twisties, and as well as handling some of the challenging conditions that a mountainous terrain could throw at you when you do a bike trip like that. Especially for a trip like this where we were running wet almost most of the time, it was just really nice to know that anything I put in these bags would stay dry. So just being able to check that off, knowing that I have something that will stay dry, knowing that if I have to leave something valuable in here, I could lock it up, was a much appreciated luxury on this last trip. And I guess the final thing I'll say about this is on this particular trip, we really put these bags to the test. We were stuffing these bags to the point where you would have to put all your body weight into it to actually seal the bike closed. Like some sketchy stuff that Harley Davidson would probably tell you not to do. We had these bags absolutely jam-packed with stuff, and never once did they blow open, never once did we have an issue. Now don't quote me on this, you know, follow whatever they say in the user manual, but what I'll say is we really put these bags to the test and they passed with flying colors, so the bags were definitely a highlight. The next thing I gotta mention comes down to the motor. I don't have any motor work. I don't even have this tuned. I literally threw the exhaust on, didn't even tune it, rode it out like that. Still haven't tuned it. I could not believe the mileage I was getting out of this bike. Well, the first time we went to fill up, I checked the trip, and we had literally done 180 miles and I still had a gallon of gas still left in the tank. And it is doing so without sacrificing performance. The 117 still gets up and goes like there's no problem. And again, getting gas mileage like that could really make or break you when you're doing a bike trip like this, when gas stations become few and far between. So could not believe the gas mileage I was getting out of this motor. Was very happy with the performance of the motor, specifically in some of the harder conditions in the back roads. And yeah, I wasn't really for want of any more power than what I had. So happy with the performance of the motor. The next highlight I got to mention here, and probably the final one, is my passenger was comfortable. You know, Jenny was getting off the bike, no back problems, no discomforts, you know, and which is important because once you get off the bike on a trip like this, the day is far from over. You got to set up camp, you got to deal with the rain. So the fact that the bike and the platform was also comfortable for my passenger is obviously, that's a win. You know, it's not going to be a fun bike trip if your passenger is not comfortable. So that was definitely a win. That was definitely something that deserves mention. So yeah, that's where we're at. Like I said, through some pretty gnarly conditions out at this bike. Once again, the Lowrider ST did not disappoint. What I will say, you know, because I am going to be honest, was I as comfortable as I would be on my Dyna? I was not as comfortable as I was on my Dyna, which makes sense. My Dyna, I got 7 years of work of getting that bike tailored exactly to me. This bike is still very new to me. There's still a couple things I want to do here and there to make this bike a little bit more comfortable for me, a little bit more sustainable for the long miles. Specifically, I feel like you kind of sit further back on this bike, which kind of like messes me up a little bit. It has me reaching a little bit further for the bars, so I might play around with doing a seat that pushes me up a little bit further or adding a pullback to my bar setup. So it's not fully dialed in, but what I will say is even with it not being fully dialed in, it still did absolutely phenomenal for its first bike trip filled with hard miles. So Lowrider ST, you pass with flying colors. That's what I gotta say about that. As always, whether you are bike tripping or whether you are day ripping, stay safe and stay low. And on that, FXDLS Brooklyn is out.